I went to an event yesterday called Mend the Gap with Katie Motram and a doctor named Aksha, and he's actually a psychiatrist, and he's trying to integrate spirituality into the psychiatric paradigm. And also Katie is trying to mend the gap between psychiatry and spirituality. And that's her mission, and that's awesome. And so she said something about how the Spiritual Crisis Network tries to provide an empowering framework for less people to be pathologized by the system so they can understand what's happening to them outside of the system of pathology. And I think she said too, or maybe I said in my note here, that people pathologized in the system, when they're able to heal, they'll actually lead the movement of people who are able to educate and create the context of something other than pathology. And so I had some insights, I made some notes, so I don't know how fluid this little conversation here will be, but one of the first things I realized when they started talking, and I don't know if it had anything to do with what they were saying exactly, but I realized that when I dissociate from reality, it's not the real reality. I'm dissociating from that which is not real. So I'm completely disconnected from my ego, which is a conditioned construct, and I feel really afraid, and I don't feel like I'm me or myself. But what I'm dissociating from isn't real. I'm dissociating into something maybe more real, but not functional and not easy to move in. So my ego reality, I feel kind of safe, I feel like myself, I do my thing. And that other reality, I feel like a homeless person. And if you think about consciousness and how it's not really separate, the ego makes it seem separate. So my consciousness actually is quite connected to the consciousness of somebody maybe experiencing homelessness as their manifestation. And so it's giving me a vision of that. But to say that's delusion and not real, I think is a little bit wrong. It actually has reality to it, and it is reality that we're all one consciousness. And if I was able to feel that, then I think that's actually real. And the doctor also mentioned, or Katie also mentioned, that her mom wasn't able to share what her interpretation was of what was happening to her. The professionals wouldn't listen. She actually did share it, but the professionals wouldn't listen. And I feel that I experienced the same thing, but I realized right off the bat that the professionals were not going to listen. So I didn't share really anything of what was going on with me. I didn't say, wow, I just had a spiritual journey for 2 months, and I experienced bliss, and I experienced hell, and I felt like I was Jesus, even though I'm a woman, and then I felt like I was the devil. Or I didn't share all that because I realized that I was being pathologized, and anything I would say would just be further proof of pathology. I barely shared anything, really, and they still managed to give me a label within 2 days. So I'm glad I didn't share more. Maybe I would have had more labels or something, or I'm not sure. So I knew that I had to go through and heal through the system that I was being given. It's almost like I was being put in that chemical prison, and I knew I had to just go through it. And if I resisted it, it would be worse, potentially. Like, there's no way to prove that for sure, but I'm now in a place where my ego is strong enough to be able to maybe balance both worlds. I also realized that the ego hijacks our biorhythms. So naturally, I maybe have like this physical sensation of wanting to have sex like once a month. But if I was to constantly like think about stuff, then I might experience that all the time. So and then by thinking about stuff, I'm creating that pleasure response, but then that's hijacking the natural biorhythm. So we are naturally hungry at certain times, but we also create hunger as a habit. So if it's a certain time, then it triggers us to think about food, and then we get hungry, versus how much of it is real hunger. A lot of it's programmed hunger. So again, the ego hijacks a lot of our natural biorhythms, and then I think that works against us when it comes to trying to fall asleep, because we're so wound up by all of this hijacking of natural biorhythms to get pleasure and avoid pain through thinking, which has nothing to do with the natural arising of things. Then it's difficult to sleep because of that very same process, which is sleep is a natural biorhythm. So by being so hijacked by the ego, we're actually messing up all of our biorhythms. And the doctor brought up a good point, how psychosis and mania are lumped in with things like out-of-body experiences or all these other spiritual experiences. They're lumped in with psychosis and mania. And maybe there's overlap, but maybe there's some things that just exist outside of that. And I'm not sure about that, but it was interesting to think of it that way. And that's how I feel like I was treated, that all the stuff I was experiencing was mania and psychosis. And those are like umbrella terms for maybe 1,000 different experiences, when if actually broken down separately, then one can actually start to have a dialogue about some of these things, instead of again having the label to shut a person up and stop the conversation from going any further to actually work through it. And it's interesting because I'm just realizing now that the working through it, if a person was able to describe, say, 10 or 15 experiences they had in dialogue with somebody, that's actually going to create different context than if a person is never allowed to speak about it. And it's going to create different context based on the way it's received. If it's received openly, and I guess this is sort of the open dialogue principles, is if somebody can speak openly without fear of being pathologized, they're going to be able to integrate stuff more. So if they share 15 experiences openly throughout dialogue, and over time somebody might realize, well, that wasn't that helpful, or that wasn't, yeah, I might have thought that or believed that, but I don't believe that anymore, and are able to reintegrate into the social fabric. And I think too, if there was visionary dialogues, the social fabric of reality might actually level up a little bit because of what people are seeing and sensing and feeling. It's one thing to integrate back, but it's also another thing to integrate up. So maybe one day there'll be dialogues of people in visionary states that look like they're in like extreme psychosis or something, and somebody's like, what are you seeing? Like, what are you seeing to help the world? Like, what is it that we need to know? Tell us. Versus, how can we talk you back down or up into proper reality? So there's different levels of receiving something, and a person can be received that to think that they actually have something of value to share for the greater good, because it's a state that is not about the ego and about personal consciousness, even though that stuff can get mixed in there. Of course, it's difficult. Like a person, when they have a dream, they're usually in the dream, even though all what they're dreaming about isn't necessarily related to their life. They're still in there. So in that way, a person's ego consciousness is still mixed in with the visionary stuff. Maybe that's what makes it terrifying sometimes, even though it's not really personal at all. It's something for the world, but it's not received in that way. And in shamanic cultures, that's probably close to how they recognize it, is, wow, you're seeing stuff that is helpful, and you have this vision that can help people, and you can tap into something that is beyond your personal ego. So when you meet somebody, you're able to actually share something with them that they might be able to utilize going forward in their life, because you can read into things that people normally can't see. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think that not everybody's necessarily meant to see things that way, but a certain portion of people do see things that way. And so we're not necessarily valuing the different intelligences of people. Like, some people have social intelligence, some people have artistic intelligence, some people have physical intelligence, like body proprioception and things, and they become athletes, and we revere them, and we give them lots of money. But then certain people have this other type of intelligence that is more like a visionary and a world-centric intelligence, and then they're seen as delusional because it's something that's not of the material realm. Like, doesn't we don't have instruments to see the way that we're able to see this. Usually we reserve being able to see things that are not seen with our instruments, like a microscope or something, and we can't see it with the naked eye, but if we have this microscope we can see it. And then so we assume that we as human beings can't see things that can't be seen with the naked eye, and we don't understand that we can actually see and recognize patterns that would allow us to extrapolate and create almost an image inside of being able to see something as possibly going to happen because we're reading into a pattern. We can calculate everything around us and extrapolate that. Just like our ego mind is talking to us and we're making visions based on that talking, this is like an intuition. This is a holistic perception, and it's something that we can do. And it's not really a mystery, but when that sort of gets all mixed in with reality, then it can be confusing, and then a person seems like they're non-functional. Well, think about how many hours a person has to train in basketball to be a professional basketball player, to perfect that physical intelligence that they innately had. Well, in the same way, it takes time for a person who gets connected with their sort of visionary, intuitive intelligence to be able to perfect it in a way that makes them still able to exist in the human game. And like, a basketball player can be the greatest basketball player, they still have to know the rules of the game. So the trouble with this visionary perception is that it messes with the rules of this game that we've created in society, because it's actually seeing stuff beyond what we've created in order to hopefully change what it is that we've created as egos. So it's like existing in a different game and still having to know how to go about life in this other game of reality. So it takes time for a person to be able to become a professional at that in a way. And there's no training, there's no coaches for that. The coaches are usually professionals that say, hey, take this pill and that will make you be able to manage in this reality that we all share, but we don't care about your perspective from what you can see from the vantage point within and beyond reality. And I also had the insight that, because he said something about being young at heart, and I was thinking that I feel like the heart is always young, and it's the ego that actually blocks that. So the heart is always young. We're always perceiving with our heart, and it's always young. It doesn't get old. The heart doesn't get jaded. The heart doesn't get these like ego thought structures and negativity. So when the ego gets scrambled and gets loosened up, all of a sudden we're seeing with our heart and we feel so young and vibrant and alive, because that's just more innately who we are underneath the ego programming. I feel like that childlike pattern, all those dimensions, those inner eternal dimensions of what it is to be a human being, the laughter, the play, those are actually patterns stored in the heart. So as soon as the ego noise, dissonance, gets scattered, then that inner child heart comes out. And again, that's in alignment with if we were never pushed off the trajectory of who we were born to be as humans. And that's why I feel too like the autistic children, they're in their hearts and they're more immune to these language structures being created, so they're more connected to those inner human dimensions, and they'll stay more connected to that. And the trouble is, though, if you think about that, society's not designed for that, and society's kind of a scary, traumatic place. And if one doesn't have an ego compass to navigate so well, it could be difficult to actually operate and not be terrified. And so then the person may be seen as less than, when really that's not true. They just don't have this false structure through which to navigate through this false structure of society. And I thought about that too for when people say I hear voices, because they talked about how usually there's a lot more to that story. And the doctor shared about somebody who heard Jesus speaking to them, but they just say I hear voices the whole time. But when they really got into it, there was a lot more to it than I hear voices. There was meaning. They felt like they were connected with Jesus. So again, these umbrella terms really stifle having proper dialogue about things. There's way more to the story. And when I was given a label, I knew there was way more to the story with me, but I also understood there was absolutely no point in talking about it. And they talked about most people, the biggest need is to be heard and to be validated. And lucky for me, I actually always was able to validate myself. I knew what I experienced, but I was able to put it on the down low and just go about having fun and actually sort of just being like an adult child and having a good time and not thinking about the spiritual experience. And in a way, it kind of served its purpose, because I had the spiritual experience, and then when I was in, what they call recovery and in community housing and stuff, I was actually just being silly, helpful, playful, laughing, making fun of myself, laughing at myself, laughing with people, making light of things. That's all I was doing. And when I think about embodying my mania in terms of harvesting it and then being like it was after, I went through mania, I was playful and all this stuff, then went through, so-called psychosis, and it was really scary. When I was able to be in community housing after, and I was in recovery and on medication, I was actually able to embody my mania anyway. And I had 3.5 years of wellness, and I was just super playful and fun, and that's it. Like, nothing special. And that might have been the most spiritual I've ever been in my life, when I didn't read anything spiritual. When the months or the years before, I was reading spiritual stuff, and so I had this spiritual context through which to interpret my spiritual experience. But then when I came out of it on the other side, I ended up with a mental health diagnosis and living in 3-quarter housing for young adults, and kind of having a second childhood, kind of having nothing to lose. So even though it wasn't the context I would have wanted to necessarily create my embodied mania experience, it kind of allowed me to just do that without thinking about it. And so here I am, 2 years after the fact of my first, relapse, or whatever you want to call it. And I've had 3 in total since. And since then, in this time, I've been thinking about mental health, I've been researching mental health, I've been working in mental health, I've been, now I'm in the point where I'm talking about this whole designing my altruism and embodying my mania and stuff, when that's what I was doing already after my diagnosis for 3.5 years without thinking about it. So it's almost like getting back to just being a crazy person. Sure, I'm a crazy person, whatever. It doesn't matter. I don't think it does matter. And the way that I was able to heal was just laughing my way through it. And then when I had a so-called relapse, it wasn't funny anymore. And so, but it wasn't funny because I started taking it seriously before it became, and that's when it became a problem. So it's kind of backwards. It's like I was able to create that, and now I have to recreate it, but I'm recreating it by conceptualizing about it. But there could be value in that, because if I'm to harvest my recovery, which wasn't even my mania, but my so-called recovery, it was more just about having fun, being helpful, getting involved. Even if it was I don't want to be involved in mental health, it was full of great people and full of fun people and nice people. It didn't matter if they had a mental health diagnosis or if I was with, the most amazing people in the world. It didn't matter. I was just around people, and they were super nice. And so I I think it doesn't really matter what the kind of community structure is, as much as just having that community structure. And I guess that's what I lost. I lost community structure when I moved on my own and stopped working in a medical clinic after living in community housing. So perhaps I'm just not really designed to live on my own, even though I like when it's quiet sometimes, for sure. But so what I'm saying is, it seems like I'm harvesting my recovery, what they would call recovery, which I call rediscovery and recreation. So it was nice. I had my shits and giggles for those 3.5 years, and I feel like now that I'm harvesting my rediscovery and recreation, I'm trying to create that context for maybe other people to do the same. I think most people that end up with a diagnosis end up self-stigmatizing and all these things, and I was lucky to be immune to that. I was just like, sure, whatever. But it wouldn't have been so easy if I wasn't in a community of fun people. So I was able to recreate my life through that. Not everybody has that opportunity, and I can't imagine what it'd be like if I had to do that in isolation. I don't think it would be possible. So by talking about it too, maybe it'd be more possible for more people to live maybe communally, or at least talk more online. So what I'm saying is, I'm harvesting my rediscovery and recreation. And even though I've been sort of up and down these last 2 years, I'm thinking more about the first few years and talking a lot about it in order to hopefully step into that again, but not just in isolation, but maybe in the context of facilitating others to be able to step into that context as well. So I was able to actually go into the context of kind of just celebration. After that, I lost everything, and I was able to just be like, well, I'm just going to celebrate. I'm just going to have fun. I'm just going to do whatever. And I've lost that. So I guess I want to create the context for other people to be able to celebrate, as well as myself at the same time. And it's almost like sharing my rediscovery and recreation journey so other people can perhaps take that context into their being as well. And almost be like, screw stigma, what are you talking about? Like, I'm alive. Life can be fun. Not letting that story spoil our fun. That could be part of too what I'm talking about with harvesting one's mania and looking back and be like, yeah, I was fun, I was playful, I was out talking to people randomly. Just go out and do that again without needing the manic energy, and not let that story given to us spoil that. And I also wrote down that I think antipsychotics take away and block our life energy. And I've never done well on antipsychotics. I've never been on them for more than 2.5 months or something, and they really take me down. And I think maybe it's because it's not really a psychosis, it's an awakening. That's what they were talking about, awakening. And it would be good to not impose pathology to those who don't want it. And it would be good to inform mental health about the spiritual emergence network. I also talked about the spiritual rights movement and sharing stories of one's awakening process. And he talked about transcendental meditation and how he's utilizing that in some of his research with people, and how it's really helping people with depression and stuff. I also feel, for me, I would like to mend the social fabric, so it's important to actually provide somewhere for a person to channel their creative energy and to design a life that is outside of the structure of society that stresses one out and makes one distressed in the first place. So it's one thing to sort of calm that, and the next thing is to also make sure someone has somewhere to go and something to do that isn't going to just bring that back right away. Why is our own endogenous pharmacy suppressed? Why aren't all these amazing chemicals within us being made? It's because we're not connected to those human dimensions, all the opposites of psychosis. And she mentioned that in Brazil there's clairvoyance as part of the team. And I think it'd be awesome to have people as part of the team who are able to provide perspective on all the things that are traumatizing within the system. So to have perspectivists, and it's almost like they have a trauma experience lens. They've experienced the trauma of the system, they've experienced trauma, so they're able to see those things that people who haven't are able to see. And that would solve a lot of stuff, because if little bits that are causing trauma that aren't needed are fixed, then there's going to be less distress that accumulates into something that is then seen as somebody's really unwell, when really they're just re-traumatized by something. You can think of it kind of like Temple Grandin, how she was able to design all these slaughterhouses for cows where they don't even know they're being led to slaughter. Well, to me, the mental health system is kind of like we're all herded cows, but we know we're being led to the slaughter, which is return to ego band-aid consciousness and not being able to live as our magical, wonderful, beautiful, creative, ever learning selves. So maybe it wouldn't be good to have perspectivists, because then there'd be just more like docile cows in the system. Maybe it's more about perspectivists to expand the system so people aren't actually being funneled back into egos, but allowed to integrate the best of both worlds to go back into society, not just as a cog in the machine, but as a social change agent. And I also wrote down a question, because they were talking about psychedelic therapy, and I'm just wondering if psychedelics reset this ekphory thing, this ekphoric sensation of the trauma and the ego, if it's able to integrate that ekphory. And they talked about making reality, it manifests with our beliefs and our thoughts, and I think also that it makes salient what's already there. So our beliefs and thoughts keep us seeing a certain chunk of reality, and there's many other chunks to see. They're already there. So if we switch our beliefs and thoughts, we're going to see something different that was already there. But now that we're seeing that different thing, we're actually acting and moving and behaving based on something different. And so something else will manifest. And I think there's actually an extreme of the salience of there's a beautiful world right here, right now, that even I can't see right now, because it's not salient. And I think in Mania, for example, that becomes very salient. It's right there, and it's not just salient, that's what is for somebody. And one is acting based on that, yet that's not congruent with what is salient for most people. So it's not salient that this world is so beautiful that we could just all be naked and running down the street and in complete ecstasy. If it was, everybody would be doing it and there wouldn't be a problem. But if only one person feels it that way and they're running down the street like that, they're going to be captured and funneled back into the collective perception of things. So I don't feel it's just about, oh, your beliefs and your thoughts manifest reality. No, reality is reality, and it's what's salient. But what makes things salient is our education, our family life, the morality of society, TV, media. All of these things are what condition our brain into seeing certain things. If we weren't conditioned into thinking those things were important, we wouldn't see them as important. So, for example, conditioned ego consciousness might make it salient for me to go to work, do my job, come home, eat, sit and watch TV. Now, if I wasn't conditioned that way, I might actually look outside and think it's a beautiful day. I'm just going to go for a walk and see where I go. So it's just a different type of lens. And so this manic energy comes in and changes our lens as well, and we're seeing and acting on different things. What becomes salient is what needs to be done, like helping out this person or that person, or you see so many things you can actually do and co-create with. It's a co-creative process. But normally we're in a conditioned, the world just happens to me consciousness, not I make the world happen. And that can go to the extreme of thinking, well, I need to save the whole world and stuff. But that's just the end extrapolation of that journey into, if one is actually living in that salience of being co-creative and learning and having that energy guide us and that intuition versus our ego blinders, maybe the end result is that one actually does save the world in their own unique way. Maybe not the entire world, but whatever it is, the aspect of the world, the salient aspect of the world that one was here to see as salient as themselves, as their unique lens, they're actually participating with that and moving to the end of their time here on Earth. And at the end of it, maybe they did save their world, or the world aspect they were here to save, in a way. If you think about it, we all go through life and we create a ripple behind us, just kind of like a boat going through the ocean. And we're all creating a ripple, each one of us, and that collective ripple behind each one of us is the world. And now we can walk in circles our entire life and create a hole in the ground, or we can go about through this manic energy and what's salient and follow synchronicity and map the entire world, not every square inch. And it doesn't even matter if we go the entire world distance. What matters is the vantage point and the perspective that we have in our heart through which we're seeing. So when in each situation in every day, even if it was the same thing every day, it's something new people, new conversation, seeing holistically and acting based on holistic perception and not ego thinking about old stuff, which has nothing to do. It's almost like when we're up in our head like that, we're not actually here, we're not actually creating any kind of ripple in actuality, in the reality that we share. We're creating this tiny little ripple, which is like the lines on a lie detector test, and we're not fooling anybody. So, but when we're actually in our body in reality, it's the best video game anyone could ever design. Yet we spend our time up in our little thought process. We're not creative, we're not acting, we're not like improvisers in daily life. That's how we become in Mania, and that's how I feel we're actually meant to be, is playful in that way. So with that ripple, if we're actually in that salience, which is our own unique holistic perception, whether we travel the world or whether we stay in our own little area, the ripples we're creating are more powerful when we're in that salience, actually seeing and co-creating based on what we're seeing versus just being passive receivers of the light of the information coming in through our eyes, and just enough of it to be able to get through the day without being killed. And then we have this ego going on, which is in the way, but we actually see it as our protector because it's watching out for those past hurts, which have nothing to do with now. So it's like this rudder that is very, very limited versus actually being in the moment and seeing in the moment, which keeps us safe because we're present, and then being present, so then we're able to act and respond sufficiently in the moment and create based on that. And I remember reading in Dr. David Hawkins' work about how consciousness is light, and there's no such thing as darkness, there's only less light. And in that way, I feel like the ego is less light. It's not necessarily, it sort of blocks the light, so it's less light. And when there's more light, there's less ego. And when there's more light, there's more consciousness, we can see more. We're not blocked by that darkening ego process, which is just less light. which it's almost like a funnel, and that's how it is, the aperture in a way. The ego like constricts the aperture, and it limits the amount of information that we can process from out in daily reality, because all of our brain power is devoted to processing things from the past that we no longer have any power over to change. And then we use that information to act in the present, which is reacting to our own past. I think the collective morphogenetic field is in crisis. It's not that we have personal human crisis, it's the whole morphogenetic field. The whole collective humanity is in crisis. And most people are numb to it. And J. Krishnamurti said that the crisis is a crisis in consciousness. And trauma often precipitates spiritual crisis. And I've talked about how I feel like this collective morphogenetic field, which is society, is trauma. And we're usually numb to it. So if we then have an experience of trauma, we then resonate with the fact that this is all trauma. And it's a crisis, or a spiritual crisis. And then because we see all of this and we're immersed as our egos in this field of trauma, when it happens that we're able to pop out of that, it feels spiritual, because it's something other than this ego trauma crisis thing going on. And it could be part of what is needed for us to survive. The spiritual awakening and this spiritual stuff could almost be like a near-death experience in a way, in that it's showing us this beautiful light. So perhaps we have the strength to carry on and to pull ourselves out of this crisis. And will we pull ourselves out of this crisis for our own personal sake, or will we work to change humanity in a way that is going to heal the collective crisis in consciousness? That's the thing. When that supposed spiritual consciousness is given to us, or we sense that, it's not a personal thing. And even the field of trauma isn't necessarily a personal thing. And to get stuck in personal trauma is, I think, missing the point a little bit. And when we have that spiritual sense, it's holistic, it's altruistic, and it's meant to connect us with that field of altruism, which is also equivalent to forgiveness. In a way, is to forgive that personal trauma, to see that it's all trauma, and we're all traumatized in our own ways. Like, even for me, being traumatized, I feel like the person who traumatized me is probably traumatized. And who knows, right? And the whole culture is traumatized with the messages that we're given about how men are supposed to be, or how women are supposed to be, or whatever. And it co-creates all this crap. And then we have where our egos are, and our biorhythms are hijacked by the ego, and we're creating all these pleasurable images based on the ones we see in media and the TV. And then we wonder why people do things to other people to get this like pleasure fulfilled that was created through the images of society and media. So I don't know, to say one person is at fault for, say, rape is like saying I'm at fault for psychosis. I don't know, I'm not sure about that one, but it's just the collective fabric of what we've created. And the doctor said that the ego is important or will disintegrate. And I have done a lot of ego bashing recently, like ego this and ego that. And it's partly because I guess I'm just on like an ego bashing bent. And I'm not saying ego's completely bad. Of course I have an ego. It's completely necessary in this society for sure. If it wasn't necessary, then people who lost their ego would just blend right in, and they'd just have no ego, and we'd have no idea, and they would just be going about their business. And maybe that's true too, but I feel like it's important to, like, if somebody, say, was given a diagnosis, it's important to have an ego, but it's also important to move towards that world-centric, altruistic element, which was kind of the purpose of that energy coming through someone, which scrambled the ego and showed a person all this beautiful stuff and made all this other stuff salient, this other world, this other dimension, which is right here, right now. It's just another dimension of seeing. It's just shifting one's vantage point, and that energy comes in and does that. Now, when one comes back, it's a scary process, once again in one's ego, and I feel like a person needs to act blindly. Like maybe that's the faith. Having faith in what that energy showed. So if it showed me how to be altruistic and childlike and playful and all of that, it's important to still be that, even though that energy isn't with me. If the energy was with me, it would blast my ego apart and it would make it nearly impossible to function again. And then I would be pathologized. So it's nice to say, okay, the energy's not there. And if it was, I'd probably be in trouble because I'd get in trouble from society. It's not in the design of society to be that happy and spontaneous and synchronistic and just like a clown, just like a fool. And so in honor of that energy, in a way, I am still moving towards animating myself in that way that the energy would want me to. And in that way, I'm changing at least the social fabric of my own life. And that, again, is going to change my path ever so slightly, which is going to maybe make things happen more synchronistically. Now, in manic consciousness, synchronicity can happen every minute, or every 10 minutes, or every day, or every hour. And if one is acting based on synchronicity as opposed to acting based on the hours of the day, that's a different lifestyle altogether. And that's going to, if I was all of a sudden to go into synchronicity and walk outside and just go based on synchronicity for the rest of my life, I could be on the other side of the planet in a day, right? So it's a different compass, and it's not necessarily better or whatever. Maybe somebody doesn't need, but it's good for a person to have that experience. And that's why I don't necessarily crave that energy back, because it's going to make my life very messy. And so I would rather just have my ego consciousness and then know what that energy was directing me to do, and do it in ego consciousness fashion, in regular clock time scheduling stuff and doing stuff fashion, in being somewhat organized by ego standards. Because if I was just completely disorganized and I need other people to participate with what it is that I'm wanting to co-create, it's impossible to do that if I'm just wandering around in a sack and saying that I'm as happy as Jesus. So that would probably put me in the population with homeless people, which there's nothing wrong with that either. But it's a matter of, I guess, discerning. It's again back to when I first went through that experience, that spiritual experience. I knew that it was something else other than what they were telling me, but I kept my mouth shut. So in the same way, now, I still know what that experience was telling me, and I still have that energy directing me. But I'm not keeping my mouth shut. I'm talking to my phone, but it's taken me a while to get here. And in that way, it's unfolding slowly in ego time, even though in that experience, that month-long experience, it felt like it was all happening now. And now that all happening now feeling might have been the ripple that was the ripple that would be ahead of me, guiding me for me to step into in my daily life after the fact. And when I think about it, it kind of is, because I'm still on track with what all that vision stuff told me before I even was diagnosed with anything. So it wasn't necessarily the diagnosis that was the problem. It was just there, but I'm still able, it's like the diagnosis and the medication, whatever, was able to slow me down to the pace of society versus out every day hoping to co-create in the totality of the vision each day, which is, it wouldn't lead to anything helpful. So I can see at some point I might speed up into the synchronicity a bit, but I guess I'm in sort of like the planning stage, planning for that to be my life's on my own designed terms. Like, I've thought about the idea of just like going out with my mini trampoline and jumping on my trampoline to loud music and in the middle of wherever for half an hour and then just packing up and leaving. So that would be a spontaneous social behavior. It'd be more like an intentional social behavior because it'd be planned. And that's why I like to call it shaman.